The borrowed lantern I used to work at a small ski resort in the northern mountains. I wasn't a skier. I was the guy who fixed heaters, patched roofs, and checked the water lines in old cabins. The resort owned a ring of rental cabins scattered around the slopes, and in the off-season they sat empty like wooden skulls among the trees. In late October, the manager asked me to spend a weekend checking the upper loop, 4 cabins at the far end of a narrow gravel road. The drive out there takes you past 2 miles of thick pines and a ravine you can't climb out of without tearing your hands open. I told him I'd go, mostly because he added, "You can pick a cabin and crash there, free weekend." I chose cabin 12. It had a working fireplace and the least mice. I got there at dusk on Friday with a toolbox, a sleeping bag, and an old lantern because the power still wasn't reliable after the last windstorm. I did quick checks of the other 3 cabins before dark. Dead spiders in sinks, busted window latch, a few mouse droppings, and then went back to 12 to light a fire. The first weird thing, when I pulled the lantern from the truck bed, it was already warm. I chalked it up to sitting near the engine, lit the wick, and went inside. The cabin was one room with a little kitchen and a loft bed above. The place smelled like coal dust and pine sap. Once the fire started popping, the space warmed into that cozy, sleepy quiet you only get in old wood buildings. I made a cup of instant coffee and sat at the little table, listening to the wind walk around the cabin. It took me a full minute to realize the wind had stopped. Something else had taken its place, a slow, even scraping sound. Not loud, but steady. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause. It was coming from the front porch. I stood up and the chair legs grated against the floor. The sound outside stopped. I told myself it was a branch. I told myself a lot of things. I grabbed my flashlight and the lantern, unlocked the cabin door, and stepped onto the porch. Nothing. Empty railing, rocking chair still, snow melt in the corner. The trees leaned and creaked. My breath fogged. I was halfway to calling myself paranoid when the light flickered on the far side of the clearing. Another lantern, about 30 yards out between the trees, glowing pale and steady like a trapped firefly. I could see a shape next to it just at the edge of the light. A person, maybe. Too still. "Hey," I called. "You all right?" The shape didn't move. The lantern did. It drifted a foot to the left like someone carrying it, but the arm I expected to see wasn't there. The lantern slid another foot, then another, the glow smudging across bark and needles. I raised my own light and stepped off the porch. Somewhere behind me in the cabin, a floorboard answered with a groan. I turned back. The door I had only pulled to was now open a few inches. The warm light from the fire spilled into the night. "Hello?" I called again, but it came out smaller. No answer. Then a new sound from the clearing, the whisper of liquid. The drifting lantern stopped, low to the ground now, and I realized what the sound was. Someone was pouring something. My nose caught it an instant later. Kerosene, sour and oily. Every hair on my arms lifted. I backed toward the door, keeping both lights pointed into the trees. The scraping started again behind me, inside the cabin this time. A slow drag across wood like someone pulling a heavy sack. You can feel when a house is empty around you. It's a pressure. The cabin didn't feel empty. I swung in and slammed the door, clicked the deadbolt. The scraping stopped. All I could hear was the blood beating in my ears and the tick of the lantern glass cooling in my hand. I made a choice then that I still don't fully understand. I climbed the ladder to the loft. I think I wanted height. I wanted to see the whole room, see the door, see anything. From up there you can look over the railing to the main space. The fire was lower. The shadows were taller. That's when I saw the footprints. Wet ovals stamped across the floorboards from the door to the middle of the room. Not shoe prints, not boots, bare feet. The prints stopped by the table, turned a little, then disappeared. Like someone had taken a step and dissolved into the wood. My lantern sputtered. The wick had been good a minute ago. Now it hissed and sank. The flame shrank to a bead and died. Down below, the last log collapsed in the fireplace and a curtain of sparks lifted. Sighing. The cabin went dark except for a weak winter moon through the window. In that pale light, I watched the door handle twist. It rotated slow, testing the deadbolt, then stopped. There was a pause, maybe 5 seconds, maybe a minute. Then a thump. Not a pound, not a kick. A patient pressure. The handle rattled once, twice, and then the quiet returned, deep and total. Outside, through the window above the sink, another light bloomed. The same floating lantern from the clearing, now closer. It moved sideways across the glass, smooth, deliberate. It stopped behind the door. I could see a faint rim of glow around the frame, as if the lantern were inches from the wood. A whisper slid through the cabin, so close I felt the breath. "Borrow it." It was a voice just on the wrong side of hearing, a suggestion more than a sound. Borrow it. Borrow what? The lantern? Mine was out. The thought arrived like a hand on my shoulder. It wanted me to open the door and hand something out. The smell of kerosene swelled again, drowning the smell of smoke and pine. My eyes watered. My body decided for me. I scooted back on the loft and pulled the sleeping bag over my mouth and nose, staring at the door. If the deadbolt failed, I would jump from the loft and go out the back window. That was the plan. It was a bad plan. The handle turned one more time and then the glow slid away. I heard steps on the porch, slow and dragging. Then down the stairs, across the clearing. The smell faded like something being capped. For a minute I thought it was over. Then light erupted outside, bright enough to paint the ceiling bones with orange. Something was burning. I ran to the window. In the center of the clearing, a small pile of damp needles and branches blazed like someone had sloshed them with fuel. Shapes moved around it. 3 silhouettes, each holding a lantern that moved without a hand. The shapes were wrong, too thin and too bare. Their heads turned toward me in perfect unison. I didn't sleep. I sat in the loft until first light cut through the slats. When the sun hit the clearing, the ash of that fire was gone. Not scattered. Gone. The ground was damp like nothing had ever burned. I drove straight back to the resort. The manager laughed at my story until I put the lantern on his desk. He didn't laugh at the black fingerprints around the base. They weren't mine. They weren't anyone's. They were prints, all right, each one a perfect oval the size of a child's eye. I quit a week later. I don't fix cabins anymore. Every once in a while, when I wake up at night, I swear I can smell kerosene, and in the window reflection, a small patient glow waiting for me to borrow it. The numbers in the walls 2 winters ago. My older sister Mariah rented a cabin by a frozen lake to finish a grant proposal. I joined her because the place had no Wi-Fi and she wanted someone to make sure she didn't go crazy. We packed food, a space heater, and a stack of old paperbacks. The cabin had thick walls, triple-pane windows, and insulation that made it feel like a padded cell. Quiet, warm, and a little too still. On the first night, we heard a tapping. It started after midnight, light as a pencil against a desk, coming from the far wall behind the couch. Tap, 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 pause, tap. I knocked back, because that's what you do when you're trying to prove to yourself it's just the pipes. The wall answered with 2 taps like it understood. Mariah laughed, called it the house saying hello, and went back to her laptop. By night 3, it wasn't funny. The tapping had turned into a pattern too precise to be random. Tap, 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 tap. Long pause, tap. I started writing it down. I don't know Morse code. I never learned. But I found myself spacing the taps out on paper anyway. A child's version of translation. Mariah said I was obsessing. I told her I would stop after one more set. At 1:17 a.m. it changed. The taps stopped being single beats. They started grouping in 5s. 5 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause. 8 taps. It sounded like someone counting on their knuckles in the wall. I wrote the numbers as they came. 5, 3, 8, 2, 1, then repeat. Over and over. I fell asleep in the chair with the pencil in my hand and woke up to daylight and a page full of the same broken sequence. Mariah was already up, whipping eggs like nothing had happened. That afternoon while she worked, I went outside to clear my head. That's when I saw the hatch. On the lakeside of the cabin, half buried under snow, was a small square door cut into the foundation. No lock, just a rusted handle. I cleared the drift aside with my boot and pulled. It stuck once and then gave with a shriek. A breath of wet, stale air rolled out from the dark. I should have shut it. Instead, I pointed my phone light into the hole and found a crawl space about 4 feet high, running the length of the cabin. There were old pipes, the fat kind, wrapped in gray cloth, and a grid of wooden slats like ribs. On one of those slats, someone had carved lines, 5, then 3, then 8, then 2, then 1. I slid in on my belly, the cold biting through my jacket. My breath fogged the beam. The numbers weren't random scratches. They were grouped neat, carved deep, repeated every few feet like warnings. I snapped a photo. In the far corner of the crawl space, something glinted. It was a small metal plate nailed to a beam, covered in frost. I scraped it with my thumb and found stamped numbers 53821. Below that, a simple instruction punched into the steel. Wait your turn. I got out fast the way people back away from cliffs. I shut the hatch. I brushed snow over it like a cat bearing a mistake. Inside, I told Mariah what I'd found. She listened, then looked at me with a face I still can't read and said, "Don't open it again." That night, the tapping started earlier, 10 p.m. We sat on the couch pretending to watch a movie, our eyes drifting to the wall. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 tap. I timed it to the second. Each group was exactly 1 second apart. The pause between sequences was exactly 5 seconds. It felt like a countdown to something we couldn't see. At 11:59, the tapping stopped mid-sequence. The cabin felt like a held breath. The space heater clicked. The fridge hummed. Outside, the lake shifted with a deep underwater thud. Then, faint but unmistakable, a second tapping began in the opposite wall, behind the kitchen. This one started with a single tap, then 2, then 3, climbing. We sat frozen, listening as the numbers climbed the ladder to 8. It stopped there. Silence, I said. Maybe it's... And then the front door latch slid. You know the sound a latch makes, that little metallic kiss? We both heard it. The door opened a fraction and a seam of freezing air lifted the hairs on our arms. I stood up, moved to close it, and found the deadbolt still set. The door hadn't actually opened. The sound had come from the wall itself, mimicking the latch. "Wait your turn," Mariah said, barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wet. "Why did you say that?" I asked. She swallowed. "Because I heard it last night. Not in the taps. In my dream." We stayed awake until the gray line of dawn touched the window. The tapping didn't come back. In the morning, we packed. The proposal could be finished anywhere with a roof. As we were loading the car, a man in an old green parka came trudging up the road. He had that mountain face like a topographical map, and the careful steps of someone who values their hips. He nodded at us and said, "You the renters?" "We're," I said. "We're leaving." He stared at the cabin. "Don't blame you. That place doesn't keep good time." "Excuse me?" "The walls," he said. "They shift." He tapped his knuckles together 5 times, then 3. He didn't look surprised when my mouth dropped. Used to be a bunkhouse for line workers. When the snow came down, you kept track by tapping. Someone always tapped back. They said if you stopped, the lake would take you. Not drown you, take you, like an appointment. "Who told you that?" I asked. He looked past me toward the lake and shrugged. "My brother. Stayed there one winter. He tapped, then he quit tapping. Next spring, they found his coat on the shore with the buttons counted out like beads. 53821. I wanted him to say he was joking. He didn't. He just nodded at the car. "Best to go," he said. We drove. I made myself a promise not to think about it again. I kept that promise for almost a month. Then in our apartment at 1:17 a.m., I woke to the sound of pencil-soft taps in the wall behind our bed. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. I sat up, breath caught. Mariah didn't move. Her face was turned toward the wall, relaxed and empty. In the low light, I could see her lips moving. Not words, numbers, counting down with something I couldn't hear. I leaned close and listened, and under her breath, barely there, she whispered, "Wait your turn." The Watcher's Window. I took a forestry internship the summer after college and ended up assigned to a fire lookout station that had been converted into a rental cabin off-season. The tower sat on a bald ridge surrounded by spruce and rock. The cabin was small, one room with a bed, a wood stove, a table, and the biggest window I've ever seen taking up the entire west wall. The ranger who dropped me off gave me the basic rules. Check in by radio at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., log weather, report smoke. "And if you see the night walker," he said, not quite smiling, "close the curtains. Don't look at it too long." He said it like a joke, but his eyes didn't joke. I laughed anyway. He didn't. The first week was beautiful, a postcard. Afternoons bright, evenings cold and sweet. No smoke, no storms. The only visitors were 3 mule deer and a hawk with a voice like a rusty door. Every night I closed the curtains after the last bit of color left the sky, because the window turned into a black mirror, and I didn't like seeing my own face moving in a room that felt too big for one person. On the 9th night, just as I clipped the last curtain, a knock came from the glass. Not the wood door. The glass. A hollow, flat thump like knuckles on a tabletop. I froze. In the half-inch gap between the curtain panels, I saw nothing but my own reflection and the square of the room. I told myself it was a bird. I told myself a lot of things. I slid the curtain aside 2 inches and put my eye to the seam. Outside, the ridge lay dark, the trees a black fringe against a lighter black sky. The window reflected my face and the yellow pool of the lamp. And there, just over my right shoulder in the reflection, was another face. It was behind me in the room. I spun. The room was empty. The face in the glass had been a warped smudge, humanoid in the way old stains look like saints, featureless and stretched, an impression more than a person. I closed the curtains, locked the door, and lay down on the bed with the radio on the pillow beside me, listening to the soft static. I slept like someone floating and woke to morning as if a rope had snapped. When I checked in at 8 a.m., the ranger's voice sounded farther away than the distance should allow. "All good up there?" he asked. "Something knocked on the window," I said. "Probably a bird." "Probably," he said. "Keep the curtains shut at night." That afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west. Not thunder, just wind and a general grinding in the sky like gears. The big window shuddered in its frame. I imagined the glass holding like a drum, then breaking all at once the way drums do when the skin splits. I made soup from a can and pretended the radio talk was company. At 7:55 p.m., a voice came through before I'd even pushed the button. "Don't close them yet." I pressed transmit. "What?" Static and wet breath. "Don't close the curtains yet. Who is this?" There was a long exhale like someone fogging up a window to draw on it. "Turn the lamp off." I didn't. I turned it up. The bulb threw the room into sharper relief, shadows crisp, corners clean. I stood by the curtains, hand on the hem, and waited. The voice on the radio clicked off without a sign-off. I checked the clock, 8 more on the dot. My hand shook as I reached for the first panel, because part of me hadn't wanted to close them until I heard that voice. Now all of me wanted them shut. When I pulled the fabric across, the world outside slipped away and the cabin was a box again. I exhaled, which is when the second knock came. Softer than before, almost polite. "Go away," I said, "like you can talk to weather." Something traced the seam of the curtains from one end to the other, a fingertip testing the cloth. It reached the gap where a sliver of glass still showed and stopped. The lamp buzzed. In that tiny sliver of window, white letters began to appear, as if a child were writing with a finger on fogged glass from the outside. The letters came slow, careful, on toe space, L. Oh, Kay, don't look. I backed to the bed, never turning my back on the window. The radio popped. The ranger's voice came through, clear this time. "Evening check-in," he said. "Weather at the tower?" I pressed transmit. "Wind, light, rain. Somebody's on the ridge." They wrote on the window. Silence. Then, "You read it?" Yes, he swore in a language I didn't know he knew. "Keep the curtains closed," he said again, voice tight. "Whatever you do, don't open them." I didn't, not that night. I lay on the bed and listened to the slow drag of something moving along the outside of the cabin. No footsteps, just a pelted whisper like cloth over wood. Around midnight, exhaustion pinned me to sleep. At 3:11 a.m., I woke to the light. It came from the window. Bright white, humming. The curtains glowed like a sheet thrown over a lantern. I sat up and the radio hissed as if the signal were underwater. The light strobed once, off on, then held. It wasn't lightning. It was steady and hungry, bleeding past the curtain edges and laying thin lines of brightness across the floorboards. I stood. I don't know why I stood. Curiosity is a kind of gravity. I took 3 steps toward the window and heard the softest voice from the radio, not the ranger, not anyone. "Don't look." I stopped. My hands didn't. They reached for the curtain seam like they had their own orders. The fabric felt warm. The light pressed through it, casting the shadow of my fingers long and skeletal across the room. Something on the other side set its hand against mine. I could feel the heat through the cloth. 5 fingers. They spread when I spread mine, lined up with a perfect mimicry that made my stomach drop. I hadn't moved. But the other hand had moved first. I jerked back. The light flickered. Then, very slowly, the curtains began to open on their own. The rod creaked. The fabric slid. A strip of the outside widened like a pupil. and in that strip I saw not the ridge, not the trees, not the night, but a corridor of white that went on like a tunnel, featureless and clean. The air sucked toward it, lifting dust. The radio went silent, as if it were listening too. At the far end of that white corridor, a figure stood with its head bent, as if it were judging the distance. It took a step and the corridor moved with it, the way a camera pans. Each step it took slid the whole scene forward without changing the size of the figure. It was closer without being larger. It was wrong in a way my eyes couldn't solve. "Don't look," the soft voice repeated, but it came from inside my head now, like a thought. I grabbed the curtain and pulled. It didn't budge. The rod didn't move. The window kept widening. The figure kept coming. I did the only thing left. I turned the lamp off. Dark dropped over the cabin like a lid. The white from the window flared for one last second and then snapped out as if someone had pinched a wire. The curtains hung, parted an inch. The room was black. Outside, the rain had stopped. Far away, a coyote screamed like a rusty hinge. I stood there until my knees throbbed and my shoulders ached. When dawn finally showed, the curtains were closed. I didn't touch them. I didn't look. I made coffee, hands shaking, and waited for 8 a.m. When I keyed the mic, the ranger answered on the first click. "Everything okay up there?" "No," I said, and laughed because I couldn't not. I think something tried to open the window. He was quiet. Then he said to pack up. "I'm coming. What is it?" I asked. He sighed. "We don't know. We call it the Watcher. It uses the glass to make a way in. It needs you to look. You look long enough, it takes the rest." "The rest of what?" "Time," he said. "You ever feel like a whole hour happened in a second?" That's someone who looked. I thought of the light, the corridor, the way the figure moved without growing. I thought of how the night between 3:11 and morning felt like a blink. He arrived 2 hours later with the truck. We didn't open the curtains. He nailed them to the wall the way you shut a coffin. On the drive down, he told me the last intern had ripped them open at the first knock. They found him standing in the cabin in broad daylight, hands to glass, eyes so wide the whites looked blue. He woke up 3 days later in the hospital and couldn't remember his name for the first hour. "Did he get better?" I asked. He said he kept seeing his reflection move when he didn't. He said voices would tell him not to look at things, and if he obeyed, he'd lose time. If he didn't obey, the ranger didn't finish. We passed a turnout where a couple in hiking boots waved cheerfully at the truck. Their smiles looked too bright in the thin mountain sun. For a second, as we rolled by, both their faces turned toward the window at the exact same angle, like they were following a line in the air. Not normal. Not human. I shut my eyes. At home now, I keep my curtains closed at night. Sometimes the radio on my shelf clicks once at 8 like an old friend. Sometimes, rarely, my living room window glows for a second with a light whiter than any street lamp. I don't look. I'm not brave. I think that's the point.